Please welcome back Susan Patrick.
Hello, good afternoon. Today's TED Talks ask us to think deeply on design, learning by design. These are breakthrough models for empowering youth, innovations for equity, and educational excellence. We have with us today three amazing educators at the forefront of organizational change, innovation culture, and school transformation. We are honored to have TED Talks today exploring their journeys. Caroline Hill, Jordan Tinney, and Harvey Chisholm. Caroline Hill is a catalyst for equity. She's the founder of DC Equity Lab and co-founder of the Equity Design Collaborative, two emerging nodes in the equity ecosystem, and she is the chief of school creation and transformation at CityBridge Education in Washington, D.C. Woo! Here's to Washington. For the past 15 years, she has worked in D.C. public schools as a teacher, mentor, coach, and leader. She aspires to create learning environments in both the public school system and in the charter networks that facilitate equity for all people, designing with those who have been historically underserved. Preparing all learners for peak equity demands new and different solutions. This challenge inspires Caroline to explore innovative organizational and learning models that optimize the role of relationships, leverage technologies, and engage people as agents in their own learning. Next, we have Jordan Tinney. He's the superintendent and CEO of Surrey Schools in Canada, which is British Columbia's largest school district and one of the largest school districts in Canada. Surrey has over 72,000 students and approximately 10,000 staff. Jordan began his career in electronics engineering technology in the field of oceanography, but then moved to education, where he holds a master's degree in administration and a doctorate in curriculum with specific research in educational change and technology. And as I mentioned this morning, Canada has been on this journey for 15 or 20 years, and they have some real insights into transformational change to personalized learning and beyond. Jordan's taught in both K through 12 and post-secondary education, and as CEO, his current role, his responsibilities are to directly oversee all aspects of the district. Jordan's passion is for organizational culture and change in a complex world. And last, but certainly not least, of our practitioner, educator TED Talks today is Harvey Chisholm. Harvey is the co-founder of South Bronx Community Charter High School. Previously, Harvey was senior director of school design for the New York City Department of Education, where he supported the implementation of 3 new co-created high schools designed to serve underserved students in target New York City neighborhoods. He worked with school leaders, their faculty, and other colleagues to share resources, maintain alignment to common strategies and the vision, and promote collective partnership efforts. Prior to joining the New York City Department of Education, Harvey was Vice President of Educational Innovations at Philadelphia Youth Network for 7 years. Harvey is a former teacher and foundation board member. We are grateful to have these 3 tremendous practitioners here with us to give powerful talks on their personal journeys and experiences in transformation efforts to personalized breakthrough system models that advance success for all youth. Please join me in welcoming to the stage Caroline Hill.
Good afternoon. Today, I want to tell a story about some of the tensions and opportunities that we encounter as we work to challenge ongoing narratives of disinheritance for some children based on race, class, or story. Now, disinheritance is not a common word, and it wasn't a common word to us at City Bridge, but we encountered it as we were reading a wonderful text called Jesus and the Disinherited by Howard Thurman. This idea of disinheritance, we had to look it up to understand really what it meant. To disinherit someone, it means to prevent deliberately from inheriting something, as by making a will. A disinheritance is intentional, it's purposeful, and it's planned. In this case, we're talking about the will of our country. Our origin story tells us that the first people to hold the pen in drafting the will of our country were land-owning white men. And over time, more and more of us have tried to get a hold of the pen. And now, the pen is in our hands. I'm a woman of color, and I know that I have the power to write a narrative of disinheritance for other people. But in order to write a different story, I must start with myself. I remember the day like it was yesterday. It was about 10 years ago. I was sitting at home with my father. He's washing dishes. His wife, Golden, is reading the paper. And the Sunday Symphony is playing before we were getting ready to go to church. And in my house, the Sunday Symphony is oatmeal bubbling, the clang of dishes in the sink, and the turning of newsprint. There was a slight pause in this Sunday morning song, and I entered that pause with 4 words. I said, "Dad, I'm gay." That's actually 3 words. And he paused. He looked at me, because mind you, I am 30 years old at the time. I'm not 15, I'm not 17, I'm 30. He turns around and he looks at me and he says, "Well, in this world, that means you have 3 strikes against you. You're black, you're a woman, and you're gay." And after I picked my heart out of my stomach and actually thought about what he meant, I was devastated. I was devastated because what my father was telling me, that who I was already setting me as a loser in this particular world. Things that I cannot control or would never, ever want to change about myself. That was 10 years ago. And I'm still haunted by this notion of 3 strikes, but not by what my father said, but by how he said it. By how he said it. There was a certain level of automaticity to his words. It flowed out of his mouth. He was fluent in that language, so much so that I had to ask myself, where on earth did he learn that? Where did he learn that? And what were the power standards, the core ideas behind that statement? I'll say that one more time. What were the power standards behind that statement? Because the idea of someone's identity being 3 strikes against them sets them up to be losers in the game they did not even know they were playing. So I spent some time thinking about what was behind this idea of 3 strikes. And I came to this idea with some friends about there are governing ideas in our society that tell us who we should be and who we shouldn't be and how we should treat each other. And I want to share some of these ideas with you today. Idea 1, lighter-skinned people deserve more love, power, affection, wealth, and grace and dignity than darker-skinned people. Idea 2, that males are smarter, more trustworthy, better leaders, more responsible and stronger and honest than females. And I'm not saying I agree with them. They're just ideas that live in our space. 3, Heterosexuals are more natural, deserving of love, dignity, humanity, and companionship than lesbians, gays, and bisexuals. And I wish there were more, but because we have these ideas, it allows us to continue to have the blueprint for others. Richer people are smarter, more trustworthy, more responsible, aspiration of grace than poorer people. Christians are more trustworthy, righteous, and more justified in their violence than non-Christians. Cisgender people are more deserving of love and companionship than trans people. English speakers with dominant culture accents are more intelligent than non-English speakers. And people who are differently abled and less intelligent, people who are differently abled, both physically and mentally, are less intelligent than those whose abilities conform to the majority. These ideas and the fact that they exist hurt us all, no matter where we are in their position. And it's these ideas about each other that justify mistreatment and favor. And when I think about how my father had to come to learn the ideas, it made me also realize that it's actually our relationships that illustrate the power of these ideas, and it's our relationships that scale these ideas. So I'm sure you're like, so what? So what, Caroline? Yeah, so what? What does this have to do with personalization? What does this have to do with online learning? Well, I know we are all in here because we believe in a better tomorrow, and we believe in the power of a better America, and we believe that our schools are the place to start. What I want to offer today is that we spend a lot of time as an education collective talking about technologies for learning, but we need to also talk about technologies for relationships. We talk a lot about technologies for learning, but we have to start talking about technologies for relationships. Because, yes, it's important to accelerate mastery. And yes, it's important to have self-paced learning. But we also need to think about, it's also important to be an anti-racist. And it's also important not to be sexist. Right now, our schools are designed to scale oppressive ideas, and they can be redesigned to make oppressive ideas extinct, and we need to start with our relationships. So my question today for all of us to ponder is, how might we redesign our relationships? I'm going to offer 3 points in about 7 minutes. 1, we need to merge our conversations. Right now, there are 2 conversations that are happening in our education collective. There's a personalization conversation over here, and there's the equity conversation over here. This is a dangerous segregation that creates a false dichotomy, because when we think about the history of our country was founded on the genocide of Native people, the subjugation of women, the exploitation of the poor, and the enslavement of Africans. There's only one story to have in this country, and that's the equity story, and it's all of us together. We have to own this story, because we haven't just inherited factory models, we've also inherited segregation. We haven't just inherited seat time, we've also inherited asymmetrical wealth distribution. That's a clap. And we can solve these problems together. Solving for one does not necessarily mean we solve for the other. We can solve them together, and it creates a beautiful opportunity for true innovation and the opportunity for real redesign of talent and expertise, and I believe that we can do it. 2, we have to understand the problem. We have to understand the problem we're trying to solve. In DC, this is the problem we tried to tackle. Imagine your 8-year-old niece asks you to explain why DC schools look the way they do. Create a timeline and a narrative to craft the explanation. This is adult student work. We did this actually as a staff. Now, with all of the Ivy League degrees at City Bridge, we had a limited understanding. Our understanding of the reason why schools look the way they do was captured in 4 points over 400 years. Slavery in the 13 colonies, the emancipation, Brown versus the Board of Education, and the campaign for charter schools. We had a limited understanding, so we had to go back to the drawing board and do some research. And we found that After emancipation, ex-slaves designed and launched independent schools using literacy to reclaim their humanity. A 95% illiteracy rate in 1860 was reduced to 30% without any government public support. Did y'all know that? That's truth, real talk. Now, this dispelled our myths about entrepreneurship and who has it, our definitions of agency and academic achievement, and their historical portraits. We also realized by looking at the history of student assignment in DC that even though Brown versus the Board of Education outlawed segregation from 1955 to 1965, DCPS allowed whites, quote, this is a direct quote, seriously upset by the prospect of integration to be exempt from the desegregation plan, exempt. Then to add insult to injury, tracked the majority of blacks between 1956 to 1967 in non-college prep tracks based on bias tests. This is in our history. And this illustrates the power of local decisions. Even though we have landmark Supreme Court cases, it's what happens locally that drafts narratives of disinheritance. We also learned that Latinx students were victims of corporal punishment, denied enrollment in public schools, adequate facilities, and responsive curriculum as late as the 1990s. Ladies and gentlemen, that's not the 1970s or the 1960s or the 1980s, that's the 1990s. The 1990s. This reminds us that the past is in the present, and we can change it. The next thing we need to do is embrace our identity as equity-centered designers. This means we have to design at the margins because we know that solutions at the margins work for all. Think about what would happen when we design with the poor trans girl of color who's differently abled, non-Christian, whose first language is not English, and whose parents didn't go to college. What has to be true for that girl to succeed will be true for everyone to succeed and thrive. We have to start with ourselves. Our identities create our lens for the world. Who we are, how we walk through the world, and who we walk with changes the way we see and interpret events. We're all biased. We have to start with that so we can walk and create a different America. We have to cede power. Everyone in this room has power, and when our power excludes other people, we need to move that velvet rope to allow other people to sit with us and be with us and work with us. We also have to work to make the invisible visible. This means that when there are implicit biases or social power structures or invisible structures that keep us separate, we have to have the courage to name it, call it out, so we can create space for reconciliation and repair. These are all the ideas that we think, and we know that this is not all of them, this is not an exhaustive list, but when we see racism, we gotta call it out. When we see xenophobia, we gotta call it out. When we see transphobia, we gotta call it out, because this is our country and we can create a better America, but we gotta learn to see it and hear it. And this is actually my favorite practice that we all can start doing today. We have to speak to the future. We have never, ever, ever lived in an equitable America, ever. So therefore, we don't even have the language to describe it. We have to replace our current discourse. That means we need new ideas and new words that we create together to create the picture of the country we know we can live and what we want to live in. Now, I started this talk with the story of my personal coming out story with my father and this idea of 3 strikes. Since then, we have repaired our relationship, and it is as strong as ever. And I called him after the events in Charlottesville because I was in utter disbelief, because I went to the University of Virginia. My father did too, and so did my 2 sisters. And I called him and I said, "Dad, I cannot believe what I'm seeing." And he took another deep breath and he said, "Caroline, you were not supposed to see this." He said, "Your mother and I saw this, and your grandmother saw it, and your great-grandmother saw it. You were not supposed to see this. I thought that we took care of this in the 50s and the 60s. He said, "I thought we took care of this in the 50s and the 60s. He took another deep breath and said, "But It's your turn at bat now. You guys hit a home run this time. You guys hit a home run this time. Ladies and gentlemen, this is our inheritance, and we are all designers, and we now hold the pen. Let's use our collective energy, our collective imagination to write the next best chapter in American history. Thank you.
Please welcome Superintendent and CEO at Surrey Schools, Jordan Tinney.
Well, that certainly is not 3 strikes, is it? That is a home run. Thank you very much for the invitation to be here this afternoon, and my job was to talk to you about designing system change. And I want to start by thanking you again for the invitation and to say that whether we come from big places, small places, United States, Canada, we all have something to learn from each other. This is my home. This is Vancouver, British Columbia. Surrey is just on the outside. I could tell you it's a lovely place. It is. It's moist. It's wet. The snow is up north, and don't go too far north. The grizzly bears will eat you, but that's another story. So I want to go quickly, and my PowerPoint is online in the mobile app so that you can grab it. And in a snapshot, I want to talk about how did we begin our journey. Historically, we have a very high performing system. In Canada and in British Columbia overall, we do a lot of work. We have a lot of visitors where people come and they talk about the story on teacher professional development was about on the highest performing jurisdictions in the world. What are you doing around building capacity for teacher leadership? PISA results, we are always near or at the top, and we're most proud of the fact that the difference between those who are most disadvantaged and those who are most advantaged is very narrow. Our students are recognized as being exceptional. We have won a prize around the greatest contribution to public education in our school district, so we're very proud of what we do. But we're not very happy. We believe we could do better. Our graduation rate is about 85%. And doing better doesn't mean doing more of the same. We don't feel that we should just double down on what we currently have as a system. Although we're proud of it, we have lots of ways in which we can improve. So what does that journey look like for us? For us, that journey is one of curricular simplification. And I want to show you exactly what that looks like. And I thought, well, the best way to do that is to give you an example. So imagine, if you can, social studies grade 6. So our curriculum is migration, government, poverty, inequality, government, economic policy, resource management. You can read the topics. So these would be the global organizers for Social Studies 6, and the curriculum would have about, as yours do, 200, 250 learning outcomes broken down by objectives and topics, and the curriculum was 66 pages. So we set about to change that for each and every subject. So the new curriculum in grade 6 looks like this. Economic self-interest can be a significant cause of conflict. Indeed, it can. Complex global problems require international cooperation for the difficult choices that we know are in front of all of us. Systems of government vary in their respect for human rights and freedoms, and we know what this looks like around the globe. And media sources, as we know oh so very well in our current context, can both positively and negatively affect our understanding of important events and issues. That's it. That's the grade 6 social studies curriculum. Over to you. So the response in our system has looked like this. What do you mean? Over to me. I would say, no, I can't say whether it's equal, but both a mechanism of panic around teachers who are saying, what do you mean that's it? And a mechanism of absolute embracing where teachers say, wow, you mean I finally have the freedom to teach to my passion and interest within social studies? I have the freedom to choose the units I want, whatever works for me. And we say, yeah, absolutely. And I'm not joking. That is the curriculum. There are, in fairness, 7 learning standards below that. But our goal was to take every single curriculum in every single grade, K to 9, and reduce everyone to 1 page. So if you look up BC, new curriculum, you'll find it all. So what was hundreds and hundreds of discrete learning outcomes, which we felt were too restrictive for teachers, we now have moved entirely to big ideas and core competencies. Because we believed that this isn't about, doing better isn't just about slightly altering course. It isn't about 15 years about let's change language arts and then let's change math. We wanted to disrupt the path, and we did. But people first and foremost said, what exactly does that mean? Tell us about this, because that seems rather general. Can't you give us a little more specificity? And people desire to have certainty of course, and so they asked us. And we said, well, what exactly do you want to know? And we said, let's gather a bunch of people in the room, teachers, administrators, parents, and we said, what exactly questions are on your mind? And they said this: what exactly is personalized learning? And how is that different from transformation? Because for us at the time, we talked about transformation and personalized learning and innovation all at the same time, and people didn't have a clue what each term actually meant. And for us, people said, how can we move forward in the current context? You should know that this implementation context emerged for us at a time when we started on strike on April 23rd, and we finished our teacher strike on September 22nd. We didn't open that year for school. So people said, how does this actually look when school doors open? So we took those questions, which were carefully considered, and we formed 4 of our own, and we said, okay, we'll try to answer that. And we asked ourselves this: personalized learning, what does this actually mean to you? Transformation, how is that different from implementation, and how do we engage with it? Technology, what role does this beast actually play in learning and schooling? And communication, how do we invite others into the circle and into the journey ahead? So we took those questions and we spent a fair bit of time, and I'll walk you through what that timeline looks like, trying to answer them, and this is where we landed. First and foremost, we said, when we talk about learning, can we just get rid of any term that comes in front of the word learning? Project-based learning, inquiry learning, project-based, there are so many terms. We just said learning is learning. And what does it do? Well, learning honors diverse cultures and traditions. It's inspired by passion and interest. It's connected to real-world experiences and challenges. It is demonstrated in powerful ways, whether you're an individual or whether you're in groups. And learning is supported by all who work with and for our students. And the sheets you see on the right were some of our original plans in working through this. So when we talked about transformation, we found that we couldn't stop talking about learning. We could not separate the two terms. And the more time we spent with it, we realized that in order for the system to transform, we were actually talking about structures. We were talking about things like time, space, connection to the community, access to information. The 5x8 timetable is not God's gift to education, right? There are other ways in which students learn, the 74-minute block. So we actually wrote this with the reason to say, please challenge the structures that exist. We know that they inhibit learning. And when we talked about technology, we said, can we stop talking about computers and can we just talk about the tools that support digital citizenship and access to information? And we said the trumpet is a tool, the pen is a tool, paper. Practice is a tool, collaborative inquiry is a tool. So let's be explicit and say the tools to support learning extend beyond digital technologies. Just because you wheel a cart of iPads into your classroom, you're not a 21st century teacher, right? So, of all the statements really supporting what Caroline said, let's talk about relationships. Let's talk about the human connection, right? Let's put technology in its appropriate place. And of all the terms that have gained, or the statements have gained the most attention for this entire vision, that last one has received the most. And then we said, well, then how do we be clear? If we have this vision for learning, that how do we make sure it's collaboratively developed? How do we make sure it's communicated in a manner that people can easily understand? How is it reinforced? And it needs to be dynamic and evolving. So we came up, then we said, well, what does it look like if you're a teacher, what does the work look like? And we said our teacher are craftspeople. They design learning conditions, and they do it in a manner that's inquiry-focused, engaged, based on student interest. And we say that they may embrace technologies, innovate, and connect to the community, but this is not a prescription for what powerful learning looks like. And learning for our students means that they access it according to their passion, curiosity, and needs. Whether you're gifted or whether you're like me, absolutely normal person, you start from where you are. You work on your own passion and interest. And in your classroom, you will see inquiry, imagination, design thinking, creativity, reflection, and collaboration. So our overall vision is learning by design, designing of engaging learning environments, and we prepare our students for a digital world where they think creatively and critically, communicate skillfully, and demonstrate care for self and others. And yes, we have years of work in what we call our priority practices, which are below, around curriculum design, quality assessment, instructional strategies, and social and emotional learning. But that's our global vision. So if these are our core beliefs, then how can you communicate something like that simply for the public in a district of ours, 160 languages? So we wanted to come up with a little bit of a graphic, so we took the same statements I shared with you earlier, and we simply talk about learning, and we talk about structures, and we talk about tools. And that was the vision. So we constructed all of that in a huge collaborative way, and then we said to people, we are just calling this an umbrella. So if this is the umbrella for learning, can you see yourself under that? Or do you choose to stand in the rain? And we said, it's okay. If you choose to stand in the rain, that's a good thing. We need people who are risk takers and innovators. But does it describe practice as you know it? And we went out to 1,500 people, and here's what they said. First and foremost, they said, thank you for the soft, vague, inclusive language that reflects our practice. That was felt so good. And as you can imagine, the next thing that they said with equal vigor was, no thank you for the soft, vague, inclusive language that reflects our practice. The very people who wanted the freedom and flexibility were matched by people who said, yeah, but Jordan, just tell me what it looks like. I can't do that. That's like crazy. You're asking the world. Where is the time? Where is the money? And this may be perceived as top-down. So I have come to understand that as a superintendent of school district, anything that comes from my office will be top-down. It doesn't matter if I ask a school to write something down and I held it up and put my stamp on it, that's the way it is. There won't be buy-in from everyone, and I've said to people, hey, when we have ministry conference calls, do you think we all buy in? Of course there won't be buy-in from everyone. And people said, how will I do this when I'm already going crazy with classroom diversity in a facility that doesn't support me? But thank you for trying. So they also said, don't change it. And they said, wait, can you talk a little bit more about technology? And so we wanted to go back with that. And I want to share with you some key beliefs about these tools. Teachers are hungry for tools, but if those tools won't make it easier or more powerful for teachers, good luck. That's my message. It won't work. They need to know it will make a difference, and they will adopt the tools if they want. And teachers need to know that it's okay to take risks. You have to tell them 1,000 times and then 1,000 times again, and districts need to model it, and I have lots of examples, which I won't show today, that we shared the journey with them. We said, here is how we are taking a risk. Teachers want to know that the structures can be challenged, and they want to know that if they take risks, you'll have their back. You will not leave them hanging out to dry. And I'm not talking about the wild, wild west. Teachers take incredibly professionally calculated risks with students every day, and they do that in the best interests of children. We also wanted to say that in refining the digital landscape, we need to be reminded that not every practice has a mobile device with gigabit wireless attached to it. And the human connection, teacher to student, is the most powerful learning tool that we have. And if teachers want to adore or explore and adopt digital tools as a part of the journey, that's great. And if they don't, that's okay. It doesn't mean that they're ineffective. People don't necessarily want a leader with a vision. They want to know the vision, to see themselves in it, and to know that they will be supported. And we also know that the core competencies, the 21st century learning competencies, they've been around forever. Just ask Dewey or Plato or Aristotle or Socrates. And when have we not valued critical thinking, collaboration, communication, connection, creativity? This is no different, but times are changing. We know our system is constructed on a set of beliefs that is like the sum of the parts equals a whole. The thousands of discrete bits that we give children, we believe, we say, is an education. And we've constructed these assembly lines of learning for our children. We place them on it. We hope they have a great time. I did it. You did it. My children did it. My question is, will my child's child do it? Are we still going to be on this forever? So what are the forces that keep this beast at play? Well, we have a firm belief that the measurement of knowledge or discrete skills is the measurement of learning. We simply know that's not true. We have a deep history of being a sorting mechanism. Those who leave school go direction A, and those who leave school go direction B. And we also have a desperate need to communicate that the investment in public education is money well spent. We do need robust evidence to say, yes, we make a difference to the world. We know that the jobs we're training people for are being outsourced to technology, and the types of jobs that you think are being outsourced will be a surprise to you. Teachers, you're safe. Principals, vice principals, you're safe. But the picture on your right is, actually, I went to the dentist one day, and she said, Jordan, open up. I opened my mouth. She stuck a camera in my mouth, and she said, sit down, I'll be back in 15 minutes. And I said, what do you mean? She says, well, I'm just printing your crown. That's a printer. I went and took a picture of it. She printed it, glued it on, and I'm out. And now I imagine there was a whole dental lab of skilled people that are now gone. There's just 3 printers in a room with a bunch of boxes of porcelain. So for many people, when they have a degree in X after their large investment, you're out pulling lattes at Starbucks, and when you think all the rote stuff is gone, critical thinking, problem solving, and collaboration remain. You also know from our current world context that people are having less faith in the system. Access to information is making people raise more and more questions. But things are changing. Access to information has radically changed. We know they're outsourcing courses, content. The teacher is the knower of all things is over. We're in the global economy, and we have a promise that technology will change all this. A system of personalized learning. But we can't talk about that without talking about bandwidth or equity. What is the investment that is required? The more bandwidth we have, the more we'll want. This desire is insatiable and unbelievably expensive. And if you don't think you're paying for it now, that's a mistake. This is massive in funding. So what do we know? That we have, all of you have pockets of remarkable innovation, but it needs to go to scale. And I go to conferences all the time and they tell me teachers are resistant to change. It's absolutely not true. Teachers aren't resistant to change. People are resistant to change, and that's okay. I mean, how many of you went for a run this morning? How many of you are still eating meat? We know that it's difficult to change your habits. Every single day, people do amazing work in landscapes as diverse as the ground itself. Teachers are the designers of that landscape, and in many cases it will include powerful technologies, but in other cases it won't, and that's okay. The tools and structures that are available to teachers have changed dramatically, but we will always need and long for the human connection of the whole that is learning. The quality of our system is defined by the quality of our teachers. Our support for them is crucial, and our mission is endless. Thank you.
Please welcome from the South Bronx Community Charter High School, Harvey Chisholm.
So good afternoon, everyone. Oh, there are so many more people in here. Good afternoon, everyone. Love it, love it. So it's really a pleasure and a privilege to be here and to be able to speak with you all about some of the work that's happening both back home and some of the things that I've experienced to date as an educator. I think that the unique value, or at least the unique aspect of this privilege, is to be in a room full of educators who are all about doing innovation and thinking innovation. But I wonder, how many of us in this room right now are about being innovation? Did I just blow your mind? No, maybe not yet. Stick with me. So you're probably wondering, okay, what exactly does he mean when he says being innovation? So that idea is really about us being and becoming. But before I jump into that, what I really want to hit at this particular moment is that when you think about being innovation, it's about us committing to participating in change. It's about us really committing to a form of personal evolution and venturing into the unknown. So when Susan and her team invited me to come speak, of course, I spent a good bit of time contemplating exactly what it is that I might say. Is there some maybe grand epiphany that I have that would benefit and edify everyone in the room? Is there some reusable secret strategy that I could share that you could take with you, or maybe a cautionary tale? Or perhaps even some words of encouragement for those of my friends and my colleagues who are together with me in this struggle. And so what I realized is that this was probably a moment for true confession, a moment for honesty and truth-telling. And so with that, what rang with me, what sat in my spirit, was the notion that the work is hard. The work is hard. And you over here, guess what? The work is hard. Now, I know I'm not saying anything fundamentally radical or fundamentally new to any of us who have been doing this work or have been thinking about what it means to be about personalization and equity and innovation. But what I would say is that even with that realization that this is not an easy undertaking, there is a bigger and greater idea underneath it all. Are y'all ready for the reveal? You saw it already, but we're going to jump back to it. So the work and the journey are about being and becoming. So seeing these words right behind me, you're probably saying to yourself, in between shoes if you've not finished your lunch, where's my program? Because this guy is supposed to be talking about student-centered learning, and instead he's turning the lens onto me and others of us in this room and saying it's about us being and becoming. Now, if you've asked yourself that question, you're going to absolutely love my response. And that is that in the final assessment, regarding either the successes or the hindrance to success for our students, that all is predicated on the consistency of our intentions. So it's not about the necessity of, it's not necessarily about the tactics, because the tactics that we employ will have to change because the situations that we confront do change. But our intentions must remain consistent. And also, for those of us who are really in the seat to be able to set the course, we've got to be comfortable with working and reworking and working again the idea and the strategy, because that really is the only lever for change and the only promising lever that we have at our disposal. So I remember in the not-so-distant future, how about this? Remembering in the distant past. Okay, nobody laughed. Okay, I remember in the not-so-distant past, I was in the midst of a PhD program. And at that time, I was really, really excited about what I was about to undertake, but I was met with some resistance. Some key faculty in the department really felt like they could not see the significance of my proposed study. They were practically outright denying that it had real educational value. Now, what you should know is that at that time, I was interested in looking at the experiences of same-sex attracted African-American male students in high school, because I knew that that population was an especially marginalized population and often overlooked. So now, when you think about who those students are, it's very easy to be able to wrap your mind around the fact that there are educational implications, health implications, and social implications related to how they go about making meaning about their lives. But after much contention and much back and forth, the faculty just said it doesn't pass muster. And so what I decided to do at that moment was to discontinue my study. But as that chapter closed, another door or window opened. And it was for me to relocate from Philadelphia to New York to join an effort that the city was undertaking to design high school models for young men of color, specifically Black and Latino young men, with a commitment to improving the outcomes of their lives. And keenly at the intersection of that work was a consideration about issues of gender and race. So although I didn't climb and ascend as a researcher, I had the opportunity to actually, as a facilitator, do and enact the work that I thought critically mattered, and in fact, do that for a whole number of young people who ultimately ended up appreciating having as a core component of their weekly experience in high school the chance to talk about issues of identity that matter to them in the safety of a peer group and with the support of caring and invested facilitators. So now at that time, there was no way for me to know that the transition was actually going to mean me evolving my focus and changing my state, but it happened. And that element is now a favorite component of the school, and if any of you were to ever come visit South Bronx community, I'm sure that you would hear in resounding unison from students that that is the highlight of their week. So now, you may be thinking, okay, this guy's up here having his own personal Oprah moment, right, in public. And if so, perhaps I am, but what I'd say is I really would love for you to just indulge me with this one idea, that the work for all of us is about uncompromisingly committing to moving forward and being open to change. So in the olden days, so when I first began my work in the education field, it was around model design and program management. A lot of it was around dropout recovery and in fact, doing program support for young people who were out of school or at risk of dropping out of school. And at that time, the big goal, the big driver was get that credential. If we could get young people armed and equipped with a high school credential or a GED, oh my goodness, what could happen? And the faster, the better. But now we all in this room now realize that that credential does not equal a passport to opportunity, much less prosperity. And that there are a whole bunch of other skills and forces that come into play when we think about what it takes for a young person to successfully transition into adulthood. Now that's one of the beauties and I think the benefits of doing competency-based education is that you're allowed to expand your mind and your horizons in terms of what readiness means and what preparation requires. It's a chance when we think about doing personalized education and learning to really begin to complicate what it means to be graduated, what it means to be ready. And the old heads who are in here, I'm sure there's some in here with me, they will remember that alongside the work around dropout recovery was the big push and promotion around getting young people on a professional pathway, right? And so how do we do that? So we do that by equipping them with the soft skills that they need in order to work in these new environments that they're entering, right? So they need to know how to problem solve and be critical thinkers. And that somehow through osmosis, they would acquire the social capital and the knowledge that they need to succeed. Now, while all of that may have been a great theory, too often what ended up happening under this umbrella was that the very things that we were teaching young people to enter into these spaces related to their politeness or their punctuality or their gratitude for the chance. And it makes me think about a phrase, it makes me think about a point that a friend of mine often makes, which is that to be unassimilated does not mean being unskilled. You should reflect on that for a little bit. So in our present focus, now we're thinking about personalized learning environments and how do we attend to the individual needs and how do we kind of build the skills and the mindsets that young people need so that they can ultimately go forward and thrive. And so in my work currently and more recently, it's all been rooted around how do we create a vision of a graduate. As a collective community, what is it that we would attach to our young people in terms of their experiences, in terms of their opportunities, in terms of their trajectories, that really do help inform everything that the adults in their lives are responsible for providing. And the vision needs to be expansive, right? It has to be a thorough articulation of what it is that we know and what it is that others would want to contribute in terms of that ultimate outcome and that ultimate push and drive for young people to take that next step. It's not about just bringing them to the doorstep or the gate without having fully invested in who they are and what they want to become. It's also, in terms of thinking about an expansive vision, about augmenting the supports that we want to provide and thinking about ourselves as members of that community, so that what we are wanting to provide to our students, we've also got to be prepared to extend to the other adults with whom we work. How are we providing chances and spaces for them to exercise voice, for them to actually demonstrate leadership, for them to have a sense of full personhood, in the same ways that we move students from one time being objects to being subjects. So CBE, competency-based education, of course, it relates to notions of identity, and it relates to notions of equity, and who are your students, and what are their values and their strengths and their interests and their needs and their wants. All of those things get wrapped together when you're thinking about being responsive to providing the necessary supports for each of them. But that vision needs to be our North Star. It needs to be that compact that we start to enact, both with students and families, in terms of what they can expect as our promise. Because too often when you get into conversations about competency-based education, it starts and ends with a skills framework. I've got the skills articulated, now we're done. And what you realize, though, is that if we're going to be about building adaptable, lifelong learners, we've got to do that inside a culture that is far more inclusive and far more committed to this idea of continuous improvement. I think one of the reasons why, as an educational field, we've not actually realized the success, or at least the potential of success for our students writ large, is because we have yet to commit ourselves to being and becoming. You know, when you think about the experience of a young person, right, the arc of a young person, how they go about making meaning and creating their identity and testing definitions and really beginning to accept or reject or revise things that are saddled upon them, we should take cue off of that. As a larger youth-serving system, I think that there's some enlightenment that can come from us remembering what it means to be young. Now, there are 1,001 dragons for us to slay, of course. I mean, it could range from working with students who have had experiences that are traumatic in schools, to working with students who have a more passive orientation to learning, to working with adults for whom this new role that we're asking them to enter into as a facilitator and partner in learning, all of those expectations and understanding how to manage it can be a lot. But we've got to commit to clearing those hurdles. And so one of the ways I believe that's possible is when we reframe our thoughts around this idea of deeper learning. So deeper learning is really around the deep connection, the application, the extension and transformation, all of those things that end up happening with young people. But could you imagine if deeper learning also meant deepening our humanity? As time passes, I'm becoming more and more convinced that there is a need in our community to be able to do this sort of work, to really not be overcome by the burnout, which is inevitable, because burnout happens, but burnout happens differently, your fatigue happens differently when you feel like you're working on something that you partly own. And so how do we begin to work in a space to create experiences and connections where there is mutual ownership, where we are not subject to succumbing to the frustration, because the frustration awaits us, y'all. It's out there. But there is a real desire, at least for this idea of full clarity, which most of us know that when you're trying to achieve full clarity, you're losing time. Because by the time you figured out the solution, the situation and the landscape have already changed. And so what do we have to do? I would say I would want for us as a collective to find ways that we can commit to being curious, to minding our mistakes and our setbacks, to really being inclusive, to not conflating who we are with where we are, to having the courage to be vulnerable, to make mistakes, to share and to care. So, in conclusion, I would say that the table's already set. This is not the time for us to be timid or discouraged. It's about us having allegiance to our assignments and enjoying the journey. Thank you.
Thank you, Harvey. And I'd like to invite everyone up for the panel following the TED Talks. Thank you all so much. This has been an incredible afternoon, and I think we're really, really digging in about opening a different conversation about education. And these conversations are happening globally. They are not happening enough in the United States, and I'm so grateful for all three of you for being here and for sharing today. I have a question that I really want to ask all of you, and it's sort of tied to what you were just saying, Harvey, on meaningful credentials. We know that students are walking out of high school with a piece of paper in their hands sometimes, and they're not prepared. They're not prepared to go out into the world. And as we think about this co-constructing a vision or heading towards graduation and the intersections with the new designs, what are the most important principles or elements of the design work when you're getting started and creating these new breakthrough models? And Jordan, I'll start with you and go to Caroline and go to Harvey. I know, Caroline, I was there in the room when the City Bridge started the first wave of the NGLC, so we'll give you a chance to think about that. Jordan, and you shared with me the work early on really that collective leadership with educators, so please.
So, you ask where to start. First and foremost, know that it's been a long journey for us, but I think the place to start is you have to believe in your teachers. Like, you absolutely have to. If you don't, then how can you possibly hope to create supportive learning environments for your children? But simultaneously with believing in your teachers, you have to provide support for them, and you have to radically change your system of accountability. You can't have a system of accountability that really punishes people for adhering to something that isn't the creation of engaging learning environments or inclusive learning environments. So for us, I was sharing with you earlier, very quickly, we had 23 provincial exams in grade 12, in grade 11 and 12 in Canada, and we've now gone to 1. So there is, in the life of a child in kindergarten through grade 12 in British Columbia, they actually are only required to take 1 exam. That is a literacy exam when they leave grade 12. Now, we will be expanding that to include a numeracy assessment, which they will do sometimes between grade 11 and 12, but you have to begin with your teachers. You have to support them, and I could talk later about what does support look like, because we have multiple mechanisms around what that looks like. Begin with the teachers.
Thank you. Caroline, as you started with City Bridge and really engaged in this design, what are the key elements that you've seen in creating these elements for breakthrough learning?
Yeah, so I think what was true of breakthrough learning a few years ago, it's not true of breakthrough learning today into the future. I think right now our schools are sitting in a very unique space. And I think for our schools to be truly breakthrough, we have to think about really what's worth learning and how it's best learned. If we think about what's truly threatening our country right now, so if racism is truly threatening our country, and if sexism is really threatening our country and threatening our democracy, it's how do we teach kids to be anti-racist? What's worth learning, right? What are the set of competencies? What are the set of performance tasks? Well, in the same way we think about mastering algebra, like anti-racism is something that can be mastered because we've got a really good job of mastering racism. Like, we're really good at that, right? We're really good at sexism. So what does it mean to learn a set of competencies and learnings to unlearn that, right? And set that as the North Star. And I think for us, it's saying, like, what could be? Like, we haven't even tapped the capacity of the human brain. Like, what could be? What is the next version of our schools? And I think the only way we figure out that next breakthrough model is to start creating models in community with people. It's not just a small group of people that are deciding what the next model is. Let's work with the folks who are actually going to attend the school. Let's work with their families. Let's figure out what's needed in that particular community and then design the model with folks, not for them.
Thank you.
I mean, I would just add, kind of picking up, I think, on where Carolyn left off, is the real focus, in my perspective, is around the relationships. Because when we are trying to create spaces for change and opportunities to do and be different, there has to be a basis of trust. Right? And when you're asking people to either step out or to venture into a new territory or even do something collaborative, absent the opportunity to connect, to know one another, to bond and bridge with one another, there's very little that happens in the fullness. I also think that for students to have a sense of place and connection as well, that idea about belonging is big. You know, for the new schools that I've supported, out the gate, one of the things that we put out as a primary indicator and a primary aim is for our students to feel a sense of place and belonging. And if you can have that as bedrock, I think there'll be the confidence, there'll be the will, there'll at least be the interest to participate in the work that needs to happen. So the relationships are certainly one of the first leading things that I would talk about. And then I would also swing back to this idea about just the culture of adaptability. Like, how do you work with individuals? How do you work with yourself to begin to think about change and not be afraid of change, right? There are multiple instances in our lives where each of us have undergone and experienced and or been the facilitator of a change movement. But for whatever reason, that knowledge, it doesn't get brought into the conversations. It doesn't get brought into the space for us to really appreciate what it means when we're asking people to step differently or to be differently or to do differently or being asked to do that ourselves.
Thank you. Caroline, as the models have evolved, in City Bridge you started with 6 schools and then it's evolved to many across DC. What strategies and structures, Jordan talked about structures and learning, but what strategies and structures are critical for ensuring equity, quality, and success? I hear people sometimes talk about equity as a noun, but it encompasses so much more, and thinking about the equity strategies when you're designing new models is critical.
Yeah, I think at City Bridge, using the Equity by Design framework, we've kind of taken equity is not just a place that you go, it's a posture and it's a way you work. So I think the 5 design principles that we use to craft the design experience, like first is designing at the margins. It's thinking about who are the people with the most marginalized identities that could ever attend a school and designing a school experience for them, because what has to be true for that most marginal student, solutions for those students would work for all students. So I think that's a different thought routine, that's a different shift, because oftentimes we know no student is normal, every student has a jagged profile, but for example, if I designed a school for me and my upbringing, there will be students who were not successful in that school. And I think we have to be confident and comfortable being very close to students who are very different from us in order to understand their experience and then design with them to create a school. And I think in order for that to happen, we have to admit that we don't know everything. Like, we can read to get historical context, but I am only an expert in my own experience. I'm not an expert at anyone else's. So it means that I have to be willing to be quiet, I have to be willing to listen. And that's a posture that as an organization we've realized we have to take. If we're going to design schools that will truly be transformative, we have to shift the power. Like, we have to say, like, we don't know everything about this certain community. We don't know everything, but we know that we can know more if we work together with other people. And I think, like, there's some technical pieces, but I think what's important is, like, those fundamental dispositions of where do we start the design work, who do we design with, and what has to be true of those of us in power. And I put myself in that position, like, who do I have to be to let other folks say, Caroline, that's just not gonna work. I'm looking at Natasha, one of our school founders, she's like, Caroline, that's just not gonna work. Like, this is what we need. And I was like, okay, you know that. You're gonna be the person on the ground. It is my job to make sure that you have what you need to create a breakthrough model for the students that will be working. And I think it's also having an incredibly active imagination. Like, I think what's exciting about the breakthrough work is, like, we're designing what could be. But so making sure that our imagination isn't just like 1/10 of a degree different than what currently exists, but radically different than what currently exists. Because we know that if we're radically different, we have a chance of creating something fundamentally new without losing what we do know about learning, right? There are some things that we do know about the brain. There are some things that we don't have to reinvent, but there are opportunities to bring people together, to design new schools for populations. And I think the last point I want to make is a breakthrough model is really seated in where the need lies. Like, do we look at just market demands to determine the need for a new school? Or do we look at true problems that exist in communities and gaps that determine a need? And how do we look at both to figure out, like, what has to be true for this particular community to continue to thrive?
Jordan and Harvey, did you want to comment?
Well, many things. I think I want to pick up on the notion of incremental change versus radical change. I would say you have to change enough, you have to disrupt the system, but the disruption has to be enough that the public can stand it, right? So you're always holding this tension of how far can you go, and I think it's important, as an example, to build from the ground up. Let the people who are in the school have to design it. To use one example, so in report cards. So we said to our teachers, we think reporting's broken. We think this notion of 3 report cards a year in November and April and June is fundamentally flawed. We're interested in digital portfolios. So if you do digital portfolio, if you want to do digital portfolios and you can guarantee that parents know where their children are in learning, you don't have to do report cards. Summative one at the end of the year, yes, but throughout the year, nope, you don't have to do it. That's our vision, so now build it with us. What does that look like? What are the landmines? What are the challenges? And we constructed it together, and in the end of the day, we said to teachers, and you don't have to do that if you don't want to. So we started with 70, we now have 3,000, because they built it together. And it's not without its challenges, but they still can do traditional report cards if they want. So teachers need to have flexibility and options as well, but creating the conditions where disruption can exist.
Yeah, and that building together piece, I think, is also really important because, a lot of times you will have, and when there are new startup or new implementations, which has been some of my work, most of my work to date, that the distinction between those who are the designers and those who are the implementers. And so until you start to bridge what that actually means and looks like, you risk having these abuses or misuses of power that Caroline was talking about, right? So I've invited your input and your participation, but ultimately I retain final say on what will or will not be. And until we're able to either adjust that fully, which is, I think, the right thing to do, there at least needs to be an ownership and an acknowledgement of that fact, because it ends up producing this really disingenuous product, right? So I consulted with my stakeholders, I got their input, their bright ideas that I consider to be really vital, perhaps powerful, but at the end of the day, do they live in a space? Do they come online and become real or not? And that often is not a question that we force ourselves to answer. Generally, it is, well, we've done the good practice of at least getting some consultation. And it's all about, I guess, a level of integrity and authenticity about the work. So if we're going to profess to do a thing, then let's do that thing.
Yeah, and there's a difference between doing what I think a lot of folks have done in community engagement over time and sort of checking a box on having some kind of a presentation and doing deep community engagement where you're really co-constructing around real issues, around what the future looks like, around that design work. And that's not a one-time or a once a year or a twice a year activity. That's an ongoing approach that's absolutely critical. So Harvey, on the last question, I'm going to turn to you because you've worked in Philadelphia, you worked in New York City at the district system level, and now at the school level in the Bronx, and been an intermediary leading change in these different environments too. How has this changed your perspective from being at a school, from being in a district, from being an intermediary? What are some blind spots and tripwires that you might be able to see more clearly looking back through these different roles on how systems change will happen?
Wow. Thanks for that question, Susan. I guess it provides me a really interesting opportunity for triangulation, right? A triangulation of sorts, right? And I think one of the things that becomes really clear when I consider those three different stations that I've occupied is, first to start, generally, people with whom we work, with whom I've worked, have wanted to be good at their job, right? That's not always a premise that gets extended to folks. At the same time, there's the realization that people operate inside their limitations, right? And so I can appreciate, including myself, I can appreciate that from a different lens now, having kind of sat in those spaces and worked alongside different leaders or different practitioners and what have you. I think one of the other things that's become clear is that when we're thinking about enacting change, it's a very, in some senses, it's a simple formula, right? So people are either motivated to change because they believe it's something that they are expected to do, something that is possible and capable for them within their reach, or something that is otherwise worthwhile, right? And if we can hit that combination or some combination of those three things, it's possible to motivate, to inspire, to initiate some real efforts at change. But I think that the blind spots a lot of times are how we appreciate each other's perspective, right? So there have been instances where either in meetings or convenings, you will have a conversation and someone's really interested in this press for scaling. Like, we've got to roll it, it's got to be big, we've got to institutionalize this. And the things that get overlooked is that is not, or should not be at odds with the idea that it needs to be well built and creative and effectively implemented, and that it's a mutual concern among all the levels, right? The internal partner, the external partner, the practitioner, the administrator, that we've got to find what our mutual interest is and our mutual commitment, right? So though elements may be within one's purview versus the other, there needs to be an awareness, an appreciation, a realization that they're interdependent, and not that one should eclipse the other. You know, being inside the school now, I'm far more thankful for this idea of like appreciative inquiry, right? Someone comes in and says, what's working and how can we leverage it to do more, right? That's not always a stance that is taken, and that's not necessarily to be at the expense of addressing those critical areas that are underperforming or shortcomings, but there needs to be a balance. And I think that's some of what I've been fortunate to see and to realize, is that this notion of balance has to be achieved, and it has to be a priority, and it has to be an interest of ours if we're going to ever see anything fundamentally shift in the ways that we say we want.
Thank you. Any last words before we close the panel?
We're designers. We can do this.
Agreed.
And implement.
Together.
Together.
And high
implement.
fives.
All right. Cool.
So, thank you. I know I wake up every day feeling like I'm never doing enough for the huge challenges that we have ahead of us in this work, and the work that all of you do. I'm humbled to be up here with all three of you, and am big fans of your work. And for everyone in the room, there's so much, but it can be done. We just have to keep pushing through. And we've got to have open conversations, and we've got to have honesty, and we've got to listen and believe that this transformation can happen for all of our students. And in the theme of Speak to the Future, let us carry on. Let us speak to the future. And thank you for joining us this afternoon. Please give a big thanks to the panel today and closing the lunch. Thank you.
Okay.